Okay, I'm on page 4 of your packet, and ironically, page 4 goes right in line with what we're going to be talking about up here at the top, the group of four-sided polygons. Now, your first reaction is probably to say square or rectangle. This means any four-sided polygon. For example, this weird shape. It's closed and has 4 line segments. The entire family of four-sided polygons is something called quadrilateral. If you've ever pulled a quad, that's your thigh muscle. That's the 4 muscles that make up your thigh muscle. Or the quadrants, when we talked about the coordinate system, those 4 areas that are separated by the x and y axis. So quadrilateral, lateral again means side in Latin, quad means 4, so 4-sided polygons. So that whole family of quadrilaterals can be separated. Like, for example, let's say the whole family of College View Middle School students. Well, you can now separate them into different groups. For example, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And that's sort of what's going on here. The group of polygons where opposite sides are parallel and the same. In other words, this side is parallel to this side, and this side is parallel to this side, and this side is congruent to that side. This side is congruent to that side. When that happens, when the opposite sides run parallel and they're the same length, these shapes are called parallelograms. So the family inside quadrilaterals that classify by opposite sides parallel and congruent is called a parallelogram. That would be like CVMS students. We're the group of 6th graders. Well, within the group of 6th graders, there's different classifications. You've got Dr. Bryan's class, Mr. Phelps' class, Miss Owens' class. Well, that's what's going on now. So if you're a parallelogram, opposite sides parallel and congruent, but all your sides and angles are the same, you're a square. So here's where it gets weird. A square is also a parallelogram, and a square is also a quadrilateral. So it falls into all 3 groups. A 4-sided polygon, so a quadrilateral, that is also a parallelogram, but just opposite sides are the same length and 4 right angles. Not all sides congruent, just the opposite sides. This is called a rectangle. Now, some of you may have heard this before, where a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. This is what that means. By definition, you could plug in a square right here. A square has 2 pair of opposite sides parallel and congruent and 4 right angles. That would make sense. But if you took this word rectangle and plugged it in here, a parallelogram where all sides, well, rectangle doesn't have all sides congruent. So that's what that means. By definition, a square can fit into the rectangle definition, but not the other way around. That's what they're talking about when they say a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. That's what that means. Then you have this shape. It's not a square, even though it says all sides congruent. It doesn't have right angles. So this would be an example of like a square being pushed sideways, and now the sides are slanted. This is a special shape that's a parallelogram, but it's called a rhombus. A rhombus is a 4-sided polygon where opposite sides are congruent and parallel, but this doesn't have any right angle. It's just a special parallelogram where all 4 sides are congruent but no right angles. Finally, now, this one is not a parallelogram. You notice how I stopped right here and we started a new number. This is not considered a parallelogram because you can see right here, these opposite sides are not the same length. So by definition, this is not a parallelogram. This is a new category of quadrilateral. What this is called a trapezoid. And what a trapezoid is, a trapezoid has 1 pair of parallel sides. In other words, if you notice, these 2 sides are going to run parallel, but these 2 sides would eventually touch and intersect somewhere down here. So a trapezoid is a quadrilateral with only 1 pair instead of both sets. So that's why it's not a parallelogram. And then finally, this is sort of a weird shape. This is, if you were to take 2 isosceles triangles and stick them together and glue them together along their bases. What this is called, this is a quadrilateral where the adjacent edges are congruent. This is called a kite, and you've already seen this before. Okay, you've flown a kite, and that's what a kite is. It's basically sticking two isosceles triangles together along their base where these two edges are adjacent and congruent, and these two edges are adjacent and congruent. And so now, just as a quick recap, quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon, any four-sided polygon. Parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel and congruent, and if you're in the group of parallelograms, you can be a square, a rectangle, or a rhombus. And then finally, the other shapes that we're going to cover is a trapezoid and a kite. A trapezoid and a kite. Page 5 coming up.